Hello, this is just a recording for anyone that might be remotely interested. About 6 years ago, I think it was, I ran a seminar for members of the public attending an event at West Suffolk College based around the issue of arts and ethics and the interaction between the two. And this recording is a somewhat adapted version of that. It's been inspired, the recording that is, by a number of issues that have cropped up in the last year or so, in which various quite prominent writers and other creative celebrities have rather fallen off their pedestals and been exposed as allegedly engaging in quite unpleasant activities. And I've seen various friends and social media acquaintances talking about this, some of them saying that they will never read so-and-so's book again or never watch their films again or that sort of thing, forswearing the creative output of somebody that they previously admired. But, as I say, they've now discovered things about that person, either proven for definite or at least alleged and going through the courts, which have put them off of wanting to enjoy the creative output of that said person. I've been thinking about this for a while, and now that I've finally got a new router and my internet problems, touch wood, are sorted, I thought I'd take a little while to reflect on some of these issues, get my brain working again. I've been feeling a bit torpid of late for one reason or another. But the interaction between art and ethics can be thought of in a number of different ways. This is by no means exhaustive. This is just a flavour or a few issues to think about. So the actual subject matter of a painting or a piece of music or a film or a novel or whatever kind of artistic expression it may be could be considered either very ethical or indeed very unethical. And we'll look at a few examples of artworks that might be considered unethical, well, certainly have been considered unethical. And that raises the question as to whether people should be allowed, for commercial purposes at any rate, to retail unethical artistic subjects. Obviously, you can't stop somebody drawing a picture in the privacy of their own home or writing a poem or whatever. That they could do the most grotesque and horrible things, but if they do it in the privacy of their own home, no one's ever going to know. So it's only when something becomes in the commercial sphere, or at least these days perhaps is publicised on the internet, even if there's no price tag attached, that other people then become aware that this novel or film or painting or whatever it is in existence. And they can then start to express an opinion as to whether or not they believe the subject matter is itself socially acceptable or profoundly unethical or somewhere in the middle. The process of creation may also come into play, and again I'll give examples of that as we roll along, whereby even if the subject matter is not of particular ethical significance, maybe something to do with the way the art has been manufactured, has been produced, the materials used, the way assistants, and certainly some very famous artists, particularly in the sort of abstract modern art world, a number of them don't actually create their own art. They come up with an idea and then they direct a team of assistants to actually go and make it. So ethical issues may arise with those assistants. Are they paid well? Are they given credit for their efforts? That sort of thing. The character of the artist is the topic that I've just briefly mentioned a few minutes ago, has been one that has been circulating again, and that is going to be the main focus of me reflecting here. That obviously some creative people are lovely and kind and smashing, and other creative people are just dreadful, awful people who do vile things. And quite a lot are in the middle, the sort of neutral ground. But if you've got a person who is a singularly vile person, they're sexually abusive, physically abusive, they have horribly extreme views on issues or whatever it may be, the art they create may in and of itself not be related to their unsavoury nature, but does knowledge of their unsavoury nature change how you as a consumer of art relate to the the novel or the painting or the statue or the poem or whatever it may be. That's something we'll reflect on. There are a few minor issues around the display and funding of art, which we'll touch on towards the end. Well, I think they're minor, but other people, of course, may give greater focus and weight to those particular issues in terms of where art gets displayed, who can see it, who can't see it. So there's a sort of issue to do with inclusion and exclusion around the display of art, and where art is funded by grants and donations, rather than being produced by the individual at their own expense and then sold on. Then issues arise as to where that money has come from and how it is used and so forth. So thinking in more broad terms, Marcuse argued that to qualify something as art, there needs to be a moral or a spiritual uplift to it. People must be edified by looking at it or listening to it or reading it or whatever sensory mode the art is consumed through. So something that is not edifying, which doesn't necessarily mean it's wicked and terrible, it could just be quite bland and insipid and uninteresting, would still class as a creative act, and somebody had to make it, but would not be considered by Marcuse, at least, as art with a capital A. It would be in some sort of subsidiary down market bracket. That is a whole question in and of itself, and one I'm going to largely avoid because you could be discussing for hours and hours and hours what is art, just coming up with a definition. For a lot of people, there might be fairly obvious examples that they could refer to. Paintings hanging in galleries by famous artists of centuries past, or indeed still alive. Stunning works of music, fabulous poems that uplift the soul, as Marcuse would suggest. But there are other things that beg questions as to are they actually artistic? Quite well-known examples where chimpanzees and elephants and what have you have been given a paintbrush and a blank canvas and have daubed something, which ends up hanging in a gallery and maybe waxed lyrical about by some terribly plummy art critic who doesn't realise that a chimpanzee made it. And is it art? Lots of fads within art come and go, and sometimes when they turn up, and they're quite radically different from whatever the art forms that were around before them, get questions. Is it proper music? Is it proper art? Is it proper this, that, the other? It's often there are things seen as too faddy, too amateurish, lacking in talent. And talent is an issue here. If absolutely anybody could produce something, is it art? Or does it only count as art if it requires a lot of training and skill and ability to produce a painting or compose a work of music or write a novel, whatever it may be? So if it's the kind of scrawl on a page that a 2-year-old could make, is it gallery-worthy art? It may be fridge-worthy art for mum and dad, but is it gallery-worthy art? Therein is a whole separate question. So for the purposes of the rest of this ramble, we'll just go with the idea that art is in the eye of the beholder. So whatever you, the listener, consider to be art, just stick with that for the time being. And we'll leave the raging arguments about the precise definition of what is or is not art to some other occasion. And we'll judiciously sidestep the very cutting-edge arguments around artificial intelligence and computer-generated art, if indeed it is art. Oscar Wilde was part of a movement nowadays termed the radical autonomists, and it forms part of two schools of thought, the moralists and the autonomists, or they're sometimes referred to as the ascetics. Those who, like Oscar Wilde himself, regard art as entirely separate from morality. So a good book is a well-written book. Whether it is moral or immoral is irrelevant. It's either a well-written book or a badly written book. And by extension, you could say a well-executed painting or a badly executed painting. the actual subject matter, which may or may not be a topic of ethical debate, is irrelevant. So even the most awful, terrible, hideous thing ever painted could be considered art, and would be from Oscar Wilde's point of view and the autonomists' point of view, if it has skill of brushwork, use of colour, tone, depth, perspective, all of the usual kind of techniques that get discussed in art. That is what would qualify it as good art or bad art, the presence or absence of technique, not whether the subject matter is, as Marcuse would have it, morally uplifting or morally degrading for that matter, but simply the skill that went into it. So it is the autonomists separate the skill, the technique, the creation process of art as being wholly autonomous of any moral context, whereas the moralists see it as integral, that if something is wicked and shameful and disgusting and repellent, then no matter how clever the skill of the artist with their paintbrush, or the author with their pen, or the sculptor with their chisel, no matter how clever that execution, the mere fact that it is a repellent piece of work prevents people from truly appreciating it, truly valuing it. It alienates them from appreciating and valuing the aesthetic qualities. So part of the aesthetic qualities for the moralists is that there must be this rather edifying drawing in of the individual to look at the piece or listen to it or read it or whatever they may be doing. Bland art is maybe a bit of a difficult negotiation area here. Something that is neither repellent nor is it edifying. It's just there. The kind of lift music kind of and equivalent manifestations in other arts. Pictures that hang on the wall that you could fall into a coma looking at. They're so dull. There's nothing to be said for them, but equally there is nothing particularly shocking or wicked or immoral about them. Is that, from an aesthetic point of view, still art? If we're thinking from the kind of the moralists who are saying that there must be something engaging about the picture or the painting or the sculpture that draws the audience in to value and appreciate what is there. So we kind of danced around these issues somewhat. Tolstoy is another example of somebody who makes this argument that art should uplift, it should inspire, it should help the consumer transcend themselves and their immediate milieu to gain something wonderful from the music, the painting, the sculpture, the tapestry, the whatever it may be. There should be something that grabs them, gives them a deeper kind of more beautiful understanding of the world. And if we're thinking certain genres, this obviously does become a challenge. So in the realm of cinematic art, obviously horror movies by their nature set out to frighten, to shock, to some extent to gross people out with a depiction of wickedness and evil and frightening, terrifying things. Doesn't mean that those films can't also include scenes that uplifting, scenes of bravery and courage and the triumph of goodness over evil and so forth. So that there can be morally uplifting bits even within genres of art that explicitly set out to shock in some way. But potentially those genres are going to be on a bit of a back footing if we approach it from a moralist point of view, where we want art to be entirely uplifting. Likewise, you could say a lot of art is perhaps satirical. It sets out to poke fun, to undermine the pompous and the arrogant and the self-important. Is it uplifting? Well, I suppose you could say if abusers of power are unseated from their power by the use of certain forms of art, then maybe that's a good thing. Maybe the human spirit is in some sense liberated from the tyranny of abusive politicians or monarchs or religious leaders or whatever it is that's chucking their weight around and being very domineering. But it's still obviously not quite in the same category as a truly beautiful piece of music that causes tears to flow down your face as you listen to it. It's so uplifting. So there are some sort of slightly grey areas between the autonomists and the moralists in their approach, where some things are maybe not quite one or another, either because they're lacking in skill and they're a bit bland, or because they are within a genre that is not wholly embracing this edifying approach to human existence. Some of you will, no doubt, have seen that particular poster, or at least one that's very similar to it. A poster from the Second World War, intended to horrify the audiences, but for somewhat different reasons than I suspect most 21st century audiences will be horrified by that artwork, that poster. So back in the 1930s and 40s, the idea was to inspire fear of Jewish people. These days, I suspect the majority of people looking at a poster like this would be inspired by fear of the artist rather than of Jewish people, and would indeed feel a great deal of sympathy for Jewish people being so horribly portrayed in this manner. So it now has a kind of almost the obverse result than the one it was initially intended to have upon the audience. If we're thinking art as an uplifting thing, there's nothing remotely uplifting about this, neither today nor back when it was first created. The intent was never to uplift, but rather to shock, to startle people out of complacency in, well, the two different political contexts that I've just outlined. Is it art? Well, clearly there is a level of skill involved in producing an image like that. It's not the sort of thing that any old numpty with a crayon could knock out. It requires a level of technique, a level of ability. It's clearly not the kind of thing that anyone's likely to want to hang on their bedroom wall and look at. Even back when it was first created, the people for whom the message was intended were not looking at it as decorative art. They were looking at it as political art. Is it a manifestation of something immoral? To the artist and the intended audience of the day, no. But to modern audiences, and indeed to audiences back in the day for whom it was not intended to be a spectacle, as people in the wider world became aware of what was going on in Germany and so on, then even then there would have been a lot of people, far more now than back in the 1940s, but even still in the 1940s, a lot of people for whom this would have been seen as an immoral piece of art, an unethical, corrupt and corrupting piece of art, expressing both the canker in the soul of the artist, and indeed we're touching on this issue of funding. This artist was commissioned to produce this piece. They didn't just sort of create it out of a sudden moment of inspiration and then sell it to a political party. It was a commissioned piece of work. So there is the sort of immorality in both the commissioners as well as arguably in the artists themselves. And that is an issue maybe to pause briefly on. If a person is commissioned to make something and the something in question is unethical, immoral, some might say wicked, can the creator be untouched by the process of creating that wicked thing? Obviously, the person who makes a knife, if that knife is later used to murder somebody, that's a slightly different thing, because the person making the knife was not doing so with the intent that the knife should be used as a murder instrument. Although, arguably, if they knew it was going to be used as a murder instrument ahead of time, there may be, yes, there is a kind of a corrupting element going on there. A lot of working commercial creative people, be they painters, musicians, actors, whatever, might get hired to do things which they don't like doing. But they need the money, they've got rent to pay, etc., etc. Are they going to be tainted by the thing that they're creating? Or can they completely separate and distance themselves from the thing that they are creating, whether it's a poster for a wall, whether it's a piece of music, whether it is a theatrical performance, whatever it may be? It is perhaps possible, especially if you're a fairly minor contributor, something like a film or a stage play where there's a lot of creative people involved, rather than it being the sole work of one person, that quite a few of those creatives maybe have such a small role to play in the overall production that the immorality of the production largely passes them by. But if they're a central driving force in the creative work, or indeed a sole driving force in the creative work, one artist producing one canvas, it's difficult to see how they can not be touched by the nature of what they're creating, how they cannot be altered in some way. And it's an interesting relationship between art and artist. As we create things, are we not changed by what we are creating? Are we not having to draw upon our own spiritual resources to pull through a vision that comes through us onto the canvas or the blank page, or onto the music score, or whatever form of art it may be? It goes through us first. And I suppose part of this is maybe touching on some very abstract concepts about quite where creativity arises from. Is it entirely the unconscious mind of one isolated individual artist? Or, as a Jungian might suggest, a fair number of religious people might suggest, is it drawn from some more abstract spiritual source and merely channeled through the individual painter, musician, poet, sculptor, and then manifest into the world? As someone who engages in creative works themselves, I paint, I draw, I sculpt, I write poetry, I write prose, and engage in various other artistic endeavours as well. For me, it very much feels as if ideas come from elsewhere and go through me rather than originate inside me. Now, that, of course, just could be a skewed perception on my part. Maybe I'm just a bit soft in the head or something. And other artists and creators might argue very differently. They might feel it comes very much from them. They may not feel necessarily that they're all channeling something external to themselves. But for me, there is that kind of, to borrow a Jungian term, that collective unconscious from whence visions come and go through the human creative before ending up on the canvas or the blank page. And like electricity passed through a piece of wire as it goes from one place A to place B via the bit of wire in the middle of the fuse, you cannot be untouched by the artistic force going through you, whether that is to uplift you in a wonderful way, or whether that is to corrupt you in a very horrible and unpleasant way, or somewhere in the middle. That's another question, but it goes through you. There is a significant impact there. Now, that's not to say you don't have your own stamp that you put upon that work, a definitive quality of yourself within it, but there is a change to the artist that comes around. If it's a fairly minor piece, it may be such a minor change that hardly anyone is likely to ever notice it. But if it's a significant piece of art, significantly beautiful or significantly wicked, then I would suggest the change is much more profound and much more noticeable. And that is a whole other kind of ethical context, not only what it does to the audience, but what it does to the person creating it. I think there has to be some kind of ongoing impact. It leaves a legacy in the life of the artist, as well as potentially a legacy in the life of the audience. Not only is there politically shocking art, but there's art that could be considered shocking in other contexts. Gunther von Hagen, the German, what is he? He's a taxidermist, amongst other things, creates what he classes as art, and the people who admire him class as art. And we're back to this heated topic: what actually is art and what is not. Where he takes real human bodies, the one in the picture is a real body, and preserves them in various terribly clever ways, and displays them in often quite visceral poses. So you go to a gallery, you are looking at dead bodies. Now, these are donated dead bodies. It's not like he's going around with a shovel in the cemetery at night. But it's still quite grim, I think. With the best will in the world, it's quite a shocking sort of thing to look at. A dissected body where you are seeing bits of a human being that you would never normally see under any other circumstances. And it's certainly highly skilled, there's no doubt about that. Is it art? That is, well, a separate question. Is it ethical? At least they are donated, so there are rather than stolen bodies or whatever. But there is clearly a very murky moral ground where we might talk about the impact on the audience of witnessing this display of human bodies. Do they come away inspired and uplifted and with a deeper grasp of human nature, or an understanding of human biology or whatever else? Or do they come away feeling queasy and nauseated and plunged into quite dark states of mind, possibly? I've never met anyone who has been to see one of Van Hagen's displays to know how they felt about it afterwards. So I can't speak with any degree of insight on that one. But there's all sorts of ways in which art can be shocking, whether it's through the promulgation of hatred, like the poster on the previous slide, or whether it's simply things of what we might call a matter of taste, where there is no issue of hatred or kind of political context, but something that is visually quite shocking to look at. And that obviously does also include pictures that might be regarded as highly sexualized, whether intentionally so by the artist or possibly in a more subjective context by the audience, who might see sexuality where others don't. There is this ongoing debate, which we won't get into because it's a whole thing in and of itself. When is something merely pornographic and when is it art, erotic art? Some rather cynical-minded people might suggest this is entirely down to the price tag. If it's cheap and grotty and off the top shelf of a newsagent, then it's porn. If it costs thousands of pounds and hangs in a gallery, then it's erotic art. Even if the image on the display is perhaps difficult to tell one from the other. There are some things like the Maplethorpe flowers, which are suggestive rather than being outright explicit, but he did include some very explicit ones, which I'm not going to show here. There is one particular one of the artist Robert Maplethorpe, dressed in next to nothing, with the handle of a whip shoved somewhere quite painful, staring into the camera. It's quite an explicit image, quite an obscene image in some ways. Well, in most ways actually, quite rank. Is it art? That's one question. Is it ethical? That's another. I mean, it's his own body. If he wants to shove things up himself in front of a camera, that's his choice. No one is being forced into doing that. And as it's the kind of image that only gets displayed in a gallery where you've got to intentionally go in, see all the warnings on the wall, and then choose to look at it. It's not something going to be hanging in the street window gallery of an art shop where people could randomly see that photo as they walk past. It's the kind of thing you've got to go out your way to see. Then there are guidances in place to reduce the unethical potential of the art. But even so, if someone has gone out of their way to go and see it, and there's Maplethorpe with a handle up his nether regions, does that person come away feeling degraded, tainted, titillated, amused, bewildered? Any one of a dozen other emotional reactions that they might have? Is that entirely reflective of the audience and says nothing about the work of art itself? So if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is ugliness also in the eye of the beholder? It's a bit of a moral get-out in a lot of respects. I can't help thinking to do something and then say to the person witnessing it, well, if you're shocked, it says more about you than it does about me. It's a cop-out to say it's never me, it's always them, it's always somebody else. If they're upset, it's their problem, it's not my problem. It's a bit of an infantile reaction, a sort of, well, perhaps more stroppy teenager than infantile, but a passing of the buck onto the audience and a refusal to take responsibility for creating the buck in the first place. Certainly, if we're thinking in terms of ethical responsibility, I think there's got to be, to some extent, whilst any artist cannot be held absolutely accountable for how every single person who looks at their art is going to react, because you can never guarantee how people will react. If you've clearly gone out of your way to elicit a certain sort of reaction and people have it, then you are to some extent responsible for creating that reaction, because it's the one you've been seeking. It's the one you've been trying to achieve. And so it becomes rather a limp excuse to try and pass the buck entirely on to the audience and say, oh, well, if you're upset, it's your own fault. Or at least that's my point of view on that one. At any rate, there's also some much murkier areas. Well, I think they're murkier anyway. One rather notorious image he took as he was wandering the streets of an American city with his camera. He snapped a picture of a very young girl, I think she's about 2 or 3 years old, sitting on the steps outside of her house, just staring wide-eyed into the camera. And without getting too graphic, it's obvious from the photograph the child has no underwear. Things are exposed. The child is obviously far too young and totally oblivious to that. And Maplethorpe tried to defend his art when it received a lot of criticism, saying, oh, it's an embodiment of innocence and that sort of wide-eyed guilelessness of extreme youth. And yes, very young children clearly are quite guileless when it comes to displays of their bodies. But then you have to factor in who is going out of their way as an audience member to want to look at something like that. Are they, the audience, guileless and wide-eyed innocence? No, they're not. It's the kind of image that's going to attract a very unsavoury kind of character. And you'd have to be profoundly naive as an artist not to realise that you're going to attract that sort of person to want to look at that sort of an image. And again, I think there has to be a moral complicity between creator and audience in terms of who is likely to want to look at something. There may be occasions when an artist genuinely has no idea that an image is going to attract a certain kind of person, perhaps because it's just something very, very rare and unusual that's never occurred to that artist, that people are going to look at their art in a very unsavoury, prurient sort of a way. But I think particularly with this, the image I have in mind here of Mapplethorpe's work, it would have been blatantly obvious to anyone with more than 2 brain cells to rub together who was likely to want to come and look at such an image. And there has to be a responsibility there for the ethical impact on the audience. But again, a lot of people might regard that as just prudishness on my part, but that's my point of view on that one anyway. The Russian literary critic Bakhtin argued in favour of grotesquerie as a form of art, a direct contradiction to Tolstoy's idea that art should be uplifting and edifying and inspiring. Here, Bakhtin is saying that the ugly, the physically grotesque, has its own power, its own potency, not a power of beauty, but a power of something else entirely. And here we're going away from the idea of art as beauty into the idea of art as motivating force behind other kinds of social impact. So when he's talking about the grotesque, he's thinking about the carnival displays, parades that crop up throughout history in different parts of the world, where people not only dress up in bizarre costumes and put on weird masks, but they often engage in behaviours that would be considered shocking or outrageous under other circumstances, displaying body parts, gyrating up and down against one another, parading bodily functions of various sorts as part and parcel of the grotesque displays, and seeking humour in various bodily functions that normally you're meant to keep fairly discreet. For him, that is a kind of riotous celebration of life, particularly from the streets upwards. So there's a bit of a Marxist subtext going on here with Bakhtin, that whilst the terribly posh have their very high-minded notions of aesthetic beauty, that people in the poorest regions of society are not immune to an appreciation of beauty, but they have their own ways of celebrating life. And that, for Bakhtin, is often through the shocking and the grotesque and the sticking up of 2 fingers to the terribly posh, who are responsible for their oppression and their downtrodden, impoverished states. At least they are in the mind of Bakhtin, at any rate. For him, as for the quote there as well from Ujali, that sometimes this embracing of the extreme and the grotesque and the shocking, the kind of Punch and Judy type stuff of things that are both ugly to look at and ugly to think about, Punch battering Judy and that sort of thing. It's powerful, it's shocking, it destabilizes, and the intent here is to destabilize art as a destabilizing force, where the thing that is being destabilized, the social institutions and structures, are maybe of benefit to those at the top who are appreciating and enjoying the kind of creme de la creme experiences only available to them, but are structures built on huge quantities of human misery and suffering and limitation and grotesque exploitations. It's like some terribly rich, glamorous supermodel or actress or whoever with a diamond ring, and it may be a very beautiful ring and a very beautifully cut diamond, but it's a blood diamond. It's come at terrible cost to the lives of all sorts of people at the bottom tier of society. Is that ring, no matter how skilled the jeweller in cutting it and how lovely it looks on the hand of the person wearing it, is it a thing of beauty, or is it a thing of blood and suffering and exploitation and abuse and greed and all of the sort of negative connotations in the history of that piece of jewellery. Bakhtin would say perhaps that often beauty is brought at the expense of other people's misery. And so any force that comes along that explodes that system, that keeps the elite in place at the cost of everybody underneath them, that force is one worthy of celebration. It doesn't build, of course, which is a point worth noting, that the force, when it comes, may destabilise and collapse the system, but it doesn't build anything to replace the system with. I suppose the more revolutionary-minded might not look much further than the immediate collapse of the thing that they object to, and just assume somehow that some brilliant new system will magically appear in its place, but leave the creation of the new to somebody else to think about. They're just focusing on the collapsing of the old. But yeah, it does speak to the idea that art can be created unethically, like the blood diamond ring, or can serve art as a force that, well, in and of itself, a painting, a piece of music is not going to collapse the entirety of society, but it may be part and parcel of a much wider movement. It kind of stimulate and build up a wider movement that helps to destabilize a corrupt system and bring it down and allow the possibility of something new and better to grow in its place. So, in other words, art doesn't have to be only about beauty and edification. Some forms of art have been roundly condemned over history for celebrating demonic forces, evil forces, powers of darkness and grotesquerie. The Danse Macabre by Saint-Saëns, which I think is an absolutely lovely piece of music, but when it was first produced and performed back in the late 1800s, caused absolute outrage. People thought that the devil himself would be conjured up by the orchestra playing that music, and ripped up the seats in the auditorium and lobbed them at the orchestra and the performers on stage. They were so irate. It's hard to credit that kind of level of reaction these days. What piece of music is likely to produce that level of reaction today? I mean, people might walk out in disgust if they don't like the lyrics or something, but they're not likely to lob furniture at the person performing the music. The Gates of Hell, which you can see in the photograph there by Rodin, it's not, the picture isn't big enough to see the details, but it's tormented souls in hell being dragged down. It's quite a horrible thing. I mean, it's a stunning skill and technique. And again, we're on this distinction between the ascetic argument about the skill and technique in creating something and the kind of more moral impact of that which is created. Is immense technique in Rodin, but it is a horrible way to stand and look at and think about, and it doesn't lead, well, kind of thing in a horror film, the doors would open up and there would be Beelzebub on the other side dragging you in. Obviously, in reality, that doesn't happen, but it does look like the kind of door that ought to open onto something truly monstrous and awful and dreadful. The tentacles of Cthulhu awaiting on the other side. Part of what I'd like to mention, if I were more structured in my thought processes at the moment, I would have given this greater credit and earlier credit. Jung takes up an idea, it's not original to him by any stretch, but an idea he takes up and runs with, of participation mystique, which can be understood in a number of contexts. The one I want to focus on here is the idea that an artist, a creative person, invests of themselves, their psychic energies, their essence, in the thing that they create. The painting, the sculpture, the tapestry, the novel, or whatever it may be, it has their essence in it. And it's an extension of an animistic idea that a created thing, in animism you have both the sort of natural world animism, in which rocks and rivers and trees and horses and cats and dogs all have souls, But there is also the artificed world animism, in which drums and swords and canoes all have soul. And part of the soul of the artificially generated object comes from the person creating it, the person making it, as well as potentially the person using it. They could, of course, be one and the same person, or they may be two totally different people. So that let's say a blacksmith makes a sword and presents it to a warrior, the sword has an essence of the swordsmith in it, as well as picking up on the essence of the warrior wielding it, and becomes an animated item. So it may not be animated the very first minute the warrior picks it up, but over time it sort of comes to life, as it were. It develops this animating spirit, this animus within it. Now, animism as a very broad, far-reaching philosophical concept developed at a period of history when mass production was really not a thing anyone was much thinking about. So the sword, the portrait, the sculpture as an individual object doesn't take an awful lot of imagination to think of that individual object as having the blood and sweat and tears of the artist poured into it. Does it also carry over to mass production? So I write a book and there's 1,000 copies of it floating about in existence. Does all 1,000 copies have my essence in it? Or is it only the original manuscript that comes off the press that has my essence in it? And likewise, a portrait painting, the original work has the artist's essence in it. If 10,000 reproduction prints are churned out of that work, do they also carry the essence of the artist? Or is a print, a knockoff copy, devoid of animus, devoid of spirit, devoid of soul? And that's a bit of a rhetorical question because I've got no idea what the answer is, but something to think about. And you could say, and I suspect to some extent, that is part of what is going on in the reaction that I mentioned right at the start, that I've, in the last year or so, seen quite a lot of people having to various prominent creative types who have fallen off their pedestals with the revelation of various scandals about their private lives, that in reading the book, watching the film, listening to the music associated with the now dishonoured person, people feel that they're sort of somehow touching the soul of the corrupted person through the work of art, through the creative act, that it contains some of the corruption of the person, which 5 minutes earlier they didn't even know about, in it. And there is an element of that going on, a kind of an underpinning animist perception that if the artist is a wicked person, then the art they create will have something of their wickedness in it, even if the subject matter of the art is morally neutral. So if a particularly dreadful person paints a picture of flowers in a vase, which to the casual observer is just flowers in a vase, it's morally neutral subject matter. If the individual doing it is some sadistic, sexually depraved monster of some description, will part of their moral corruption leach into the art that they are creating? And therefore anyone who quite innocently comes along and looks at this picture of a painting of flowers in a vase, will they be tainted by what they are looking at? I suspect the belief that that might happen is probably quite widespread, even amongst people who might consider animism irrelevant or nonsensical in other contexts, that there is nonetheless some of that going on there. And you can certainly see, I've engaged in animistic art myself, that as someone who holds to that philosophy, when I create something, I do feel I am putting myself into that painting, or drawing or whatever it might be. And if I gift it away or sell it, then part of me is going with it. That I have my mystique has participated in the creation of the art. There is a bit of me inside it, even if to the vast majority of people looking at that picture, they probably wouldn't have a clue who the hell I am, and not have any profound mystic psychic experiences of picking up on my presence in the created artwork. But nonetheless, I'm in it somewhere. Whether for good or for ill or for neutral, that's another question again. Martha Nussbaum makes an argument about the causal ethics of art, which is to do with the impact of art on the audience. So less about whether the artist is a good person or a wicked person or whatever, more to do with the idea that, again, some art, you look at it, you go away as an audience feeling uplifted and transformed and improved. Others, you go away feeling dirty and grotty and in need of a shower. So for Nussbaum, if the causal impact of art is to make the audience feel grubby and filthy and defiled and tainted, then it is bad art. It is immoral art. It is the kind of art that should not be on display because of the corrupting impact it has on people. So we're back to the idea that art should be uplifting, or at the very least kind of neutral, but certainly not corrupting and degrading and debauching of the audience. Mentioned very briefly at the start this idea that the way in which art is created can have an ethical context in and of itself, and just a lightning quick revisit to that, but only lightning quick because I'm trying to focus on other things. It may be that the materials that art is made out of have an ethical element to them. If somebody is making something out of, let's say, body parts, and not just in the sense of Van Hagen's preserved corpses, but they could be making things with feathers, animal horn, animal hide. How has that been sourced? Is it from an animal that is very populous, or is it from an endangered species where bumping one of them off to create the artwork is profoundly immoral in and of itself? Art composed from bodily fluids, that brings in sort of sanitary issues and all sorts of factors in and of itself, how something is created. So as a couple of practical examples of what may seem a fairly abstract idea at the moment. This poor old dog in the photograph, probably long since dead by now because this is going back to 2007, but you can see that the dog is tethered to the wall. Jimenez in Nicaragua created this bit of art, if you can call it that, in which he found a starving dog on the streets. I'm sure there's plenty of starving dogs wandering around Nicaragua. Brought it into a gallery, tethered it to the wall, and that was it. That was the art. This I'm not quite sure whether you'd call it an installation or whatever the proper terminology would be. But people came into the gallery and they looked at various more conventional forms of art hanging on the wall. And there was this poor old dog, half starved, tied up. And that was it. There was an outrage. I'm sure if he'd done this in Britain rather than in Nicaragua, he'd probably have the amassed forces of the local WI coming around to stab him to death with their knitting needles. And quite right, too. An appalling thing to do. Allegedly, there was an investigation, and allegedly the dog escaped quite quickly and was back on the streets, so wasn't kept there till it starved to death. And in his own defence, Jimenez was saying things along the line of he wanted to see how the art patrons coming to the gallery reacted. So when they were all sipping their champagne and nibbling their cocktail sausages, whatever the hell it was that they were eating, did they chuck this poor old starving dog some food to eat, or did they just look at it and walk away, allowing the dog to go on starving? So they might have expressed shock, but did they do anything about it? Did any of them take the dog home and feed it and look after it? Well, clearly no. If the dog escaped from the gallery, it's not because one of these wealthy patrons at the art gallery swanning around felt sorry for the poor old thing and took it home and gave it a good life, which is what I would have done. I'd just cut the cord, punch the gallery owner, and take the dog away. That would be the ethical response, but obviously nobody did that. So is he making a point? Well, points like that are so trite and irrelevant. It's debatable if it's a point even worth making for some poor half-starved dog. He did another thing where he showed photos of a dog starving to death. And there was, again, huge outrage of that. And he said, actually, the dog didn't starve to death. These were photos done in reverse. So he'd found a dog already starving on the streets and fed it up, and then put the photos on the wall in the opposite order. So it looked as if the dog was getting thinner, when in reality the dog was getting fatter by being fed up. Hopefully it's true that he fed the dog and the poor thing was adopted and had a good life, but clearly he's an artist who makes his money from grossing people out and shocking them by doing unsavoury things. He would probably say that he was bringing the kind of cruelty and indifference of humanity into focus. But I'm sure there's much better ways of doing it than putting some poor, terrified animal on a tether in a gallery to be gawped at by vacuous snobs wandering past. So art as cruelty, cruelty as art. There are other, what might be considered very transgressive forms of art, having mentioned bodily fluids earlier. Immersion by Serrano on the left-hand side there, without getting too graphic, is a crucifix, as you can see, placed in a perspex box in which the artist has pissed. So the fluid is the artist's own urine. Clearly didn't go down too well with Catholics, for understandable reasons. There are a lot of irate people protesting. I don't think, so far as I know, it ever went beyond verbal and written protests. I suspect with some religions, if you went and urinated all over their sacred objects, they'd probably set light to the gallery rather than write a strongly worded letter. But to the best of my knowledge, the Catholics retained or restrained their protests to more sedate forms of protest and regarded this as blasphemous. And again, can art be blasphemous? Clearly it can be. Should art be blasphemous? Is it an appropriate thing to do to try and horrify sections of your audience by doing something truly grim and gruesome? The earrings, one in the middle, they are fetuses, aborted fetuses that's been worn as earrings. And the one on the far left, someone has, the guy lying on the floor, has been branded with a hot iron. So that's not a tattoo or an image painted onto his skin. That is the result of shoving a red hot iron onto the skin and burned into the body permanently. Again, that was out of choice. No one was forced into that. Is somebody cutting themselves, harming themselves, engaging in bodily damage willingly? Is it ethical? It begs questions of people's psychiatric states of mind and the degree to which somebody with mental health problems can fully make informed consent to have their own body mutilated in the pursuit of art, even if it's the artist themselves, as it was in this occasion, who's having their body mutilated. Do they need encouraging or do they need sectioning? And is the audience becoming immoral by encouraging it instead of saying this person needs some kind of psychiatric intervention rather than the rewards of fame and popularity and financial incentives to keep on doing what they're doing? Many would consider it art, others would not. But back to this issue of the character of the artist. Lots of questions get begged here about how we can, or even can we, distinguish between the character of the artist and their art output. Should we only look at art created by lovely people? Or should we engage with art created by dreadful people? I suspect if we only ever engage with the art created by lovely people, there would be very few art galleries, very few theatres, very few bookshops, very few galleries or any other kind of venue for art, because of the sheer volume of creative people who are not terribly pleasant people. Not all of them, clearly some of them are going to be lovely people, but there is a sizable chunk of creative types who are deeply unstable, morally reprehensible, generally not very nice people, and may indeed argue, some of them, that their art is the product of the kind of traumatic experiences they've gone through in the past, and maybe the traumatic experiences that they've inflicted on others in the course of their life. Is art born out of joy and happiness and uplift and kindness, or is art, sometimes at least, born out of pain and suffering and misery and distress? Obviously, there are forms of art born out of both. If we only ever look at one, then we're going to be quite restricted in what we're able to access and look at. There are various famous people, a few of them on the screen there, who have been artists of various degrees of technical proficiency, who have later been revealed to have done various horrible and unsavoury things, deeply horrible and unsavoury things, in fact. But, Eric Gill's statue still stands out, or one of his statues still stands outside the BBC building on full display. It's never been taken down. I don't think much of Rolf Harris's music gets played anymore on radio, and I doubt there's many galleries still displaying his artwork, although some of it may be in private collections. Vikernes was a musician, but again, doesn't have their music played on radio and so forth anymore following the trial. Is that reasonable, or do we need to make a distinction? Doubt this. There are famous artists from hundreds of years ago whose personal lives are either just forgotten about with the passage of time, or were never much known about in the first place. But if they were known in any detail, probably wouldn't stand too much scrutiny. People who've done fairly dreadful things in the course of their lives. Should we no longer look at their statues or their paintings or listen to their music or read their books because they have done vile things? These three characters are in living memory. I think Rolf Harris is still alive. That they don't have the patina of centuries to separate them from their audiences. So we might look at artists from the 15th century or artists from ancient Greece or wherever, and they're so far in the past that whatever horrible things they got up to in their private lives have been largely forgotten about. And so we just look at the art. We no longer think about the person who created it. A distinction, a separation has been made. And maybe at some point in the future, we will make separations from the people whose reputations have been besmirched by their own sexual depravity or violence or immorality of one sort or another in recent years. So it's perhaps too soon to be talking about appreciating the art of people who have fallen off their pedestals within the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Maybe you have to wait 100 years, 200 years, 300 years between the end of their life and the ability to value their artwork as a phenomena distinct from the artist. Going back to animism, might be argued that is not wholly possible. Even where you know nothing about the artist, they're an unknown factor. Nonetheless, some of them will still be present within the art. Whether or not the audience fully perceives that is a separate issue, but there'll be the kind of essence of them there, even where they are not a known person. So whether we do or don't know the details of their private life, we may still be imbibing of them in some context or another. There's also the double standard that we are having these discussions about what we might call a very select form of art: painters, musicians, sculptors, and so forth. Do we get terribly worked up about the private lives of scientists? I'm sure there must be scandals impacting the private lives of inventors, of engineers, of mechanics, of people who make things, but they don't tend to reach the press. We don't tend to get into uproar because some inventive person has beaten their wife black and blue, or molested children, or done whatever horrible things it is that they've done. I suppose the closest we're getting to some kind of reaction in that context is with Elon Musk, where some people, based upon what they believe to be his politics, I'm not going to get bogged down into the endless debates about whether that belief is valid or not, but they have a perception that he has less than savoury politics and are getting terribly irate about Tesla cars and things like that. So there is a reaction to some forms of technology based upon the connection to the person who, well, he didn't actually invent the Tesla car, in all fairness. He markets it rather than makes it. But there's a reaction going on there nonetheless. But it is unusual to have a reaction against, shall we say, someone whose fame is in the realm of technology rather than someone whose fame is in the realm of the creative or of the performing arts. And is that entirely fair? If we don't want to handle the products of tainted minds, should that apply as much to our laptops and phones and clothing and what have you as it does to paintings on the wall and songs and statues? It is a very odd double standard that we only fixate on the morality of certain types of creatives and not on the morality of other types of creatives. Maybe we need to pull our head out of our nether regions and not get too fussed. As McCarthy suggests here, Eric Gill, the man in the central photograph, who was engaged in abusive, incestuous relationships with his own family, even had a zoophilic relationship with his own dog, which doesn't bear thinking about. Far from falling off his pedestal and being condemned as an absolute pervert, seems to have gone from strength to strength in terms of his reputation. Is this because he is terribly, or was terribly, terribly, terribly middle class? Some working class types might fall off their pedestal and stay down. Others seem to get lauded. Now, that doesn't imply in every case. You get people who are decidedly of an upper social bracket who fall off their pedestal and never get put back on it. So there are exceptions to that, but the interrelationship between social class and perceptions about who can do what and get away with it and who can't get away with it, who gets lambasted and who gets let off the hook, can't help but think that there is an element of class and snobbery and money that comes into play with this one, which doesn't reflect well on us as a society, perhaps, that either we hold everyone equally accountable or we let everyone equally off the hook and not engage in this kind of selectivity of feigning outrage about person A whilst looking in a completely different direction when it comes to person B, who has done things no less horrible, no less awful than person A has done. Lots of double standards going on. Mentioned very briefly at the start about the issues of displaying and financing art, just to quickly recap them before I'll finally stop talking. An element of art, whether it's visual or performing or whatever, is who can see it, who can participate in it, who can enjoy it. If something is on private display, a very limited number of people can enjoy it. If it's in a public gallery, a much wider number of people can enjoy it. Likewise, if it's, say, performances of music or theatre or something in that vein, it's restricted to whoever can afford the tickets, unless efforts are made to give freebie performances so that all and sundry can enjoy it. So there's concerns that get raised about whether certain forms of art are made intentionally very exclusive so that only a very privileged section of the public can participate in them, or whether efforts are made to include those who can't normally afford the tickets to go along and see a performance, look at pictures, do whatever it is that they're going to do, and enjoy that form of art. So there's a kind of an ethical question about the accessibility for the audience. Who can see what, and indeed some art that is considered so outrageous that it has to be kept locked away, preserved for all time, but locked away so that only a very, very, very select few people are allowed to see it at all. And they have to be sort of thoroughly vetted before they're allowed to go and see certain outrageous pieces of art. And the financing issue. Some artists, of course, probably the majority of artists are self-financing. They produce their works and then hope to retail them, make a bit of money back. Others are able to access grants, whether that's to create the art in the first place or grants to display the art, for the subsidies from museum collections and the like. Should it matter where the money comes from? So should we only, as artistic people, accept money from morally squeaky clean sources, in which case we probably never accept money from anybody anywhere, because very few people get to be extremely rich by being morally squeaky clean. Most people get to be extremely rich by doing a few fairly ruthless and dodgy things to make that scale of money. Or should we just take the money and make what good of it we can, regardless of how that money was acquired in the first place? Very mixed opinions on that one, and I'm not going to get bogged down in which one I come down on myself, but just to flag it up as an issue, which you'll be relieved to know means I now stop talking. It's been more of a ramble for my own benefit to try and get my brain animated and working again. But hopefully it's promoted a few questions and given pause for thought, and I'm sure people listening will have their own views on the link between morality and art, and maybe you'll post a few comments and start a discussion going. I don't think there's any absolutely right or absolutely wrong answers on this. It's more about getting a discussion going around whether it's the nature of the art, certain images that may be seen as shocking or appalling or whatever, or the nature of the artist and how we relate to art created by somebody we know to be a fairly dreadful person. How do we engage with these issues? But yes, post your thoughts, start a conversation, and let's see where we end up. Thank you.